I've always had such a deep fascination with content that was cut from Halo games. Honestly, I feel like at this point, I'm more familiar with content that was cut from the original Halo trilogy than I am with my own sense of self. Reach, however, not so much. Out of pure curiosity, I recently found myself going down the rabbit hole of Reach cut content for the first time ever, actually, and what I found surprised me so much that I ended up turning that late night deep dive into this very video. And of course, I want to start out by looking at the earliest original plans that Bungie had for Reach's campaign, which, when compared to what we ultimately got, are absolutely fascinating. So this image, shared by Marcus Leto, is the earliest known plan for Reach's campaign, broken down level by level in chronological order. And although this is very much a kind of general overview that lacks some specifics, I do find it interesting that in this rather different version of the campaign, it still had 11 levels like the one that we ended up getting. And then, in addition to this document, Marcus also shared a couple others from the exact same point in development. So, let's add them all together and try and build a picture of the earliest version of Reach's story. So, instead of the game opening with Noble Actual, of course the cutscene that formally introduced us to Noble Team, it would have opened with a cinematic of a Marine, likely post-war, recalling back to events just before the last Great War began, specifically pertaining to some sort of mysterious pivotal thing with which he was involved. Now I gotta say, at face value, this sounds really similar to the extra videos that Bungie created for the Halo 3 Believe campaign, which focused on veterans of the Human Covenant War many years in the future, revisiting technology and the sites of battles from the war that they fought in a very kind of Vietnam documentary style. Those videos were extremely impactful, and so I feel like this cutscene might have been as well. I'm also pretty sure that that mysterious pivotal thing would have been Cortana, or at least some kind of foreigner data gathered from the ship. I mean, literally, what else could it have been? The foreigner staff? Okay, well, we'll get into that thing later on. It's also worth noting that at this point, Reach was referred to as the Last Great War, and it was said to be a battle that lasted for 9 months instead of the 37 days that it lasted in Reach, and also instead of the, mere hours that it lasted in the Fall of Reach. Suffice to say, Bungie had quite a few different ideas when it came to the timeline of the Battle of Reach. The first actual level, nicknamed Opening Infantry Battle, sounds a little bit similar to Winter Contingency, given that it was said to include communications of some sort, which of course is similar to the Visegrad relay station going offline, but it does sound like this was meant to be way more of a tutorial level, given the other 2 bullet points for it are training and squad training, which does make me wonder if some kind of Republic Commando squad mechanics were intended to be in Reach at one point. I also assume that at some point during this level, likely in its intro cutscene, we would have gotten a kind of Noble Actual style introduction to Noble Team. I mean, from that intro cinematic, you could, I guess, make the argument that Bungie originally intended for you to play as a Marine in Reach, but we know from the recent dig site leaks, which unfortunately I can't show, and also from various other sources that playing as a unique squad of Spartans was pretty much the plan with Reach from the get-go. The second level seems pretty different to Oni Sword Base because, for starters, it didn't take place at Oni Sword Base, nor did it take place at any Oni or UNSC facility for that matter. Rather, it was a frantic opening battle, seat of your pants terror, in a small coastal city with lots of civilians that was said to be more of an experience than combat. Now, it's pretty obvious that this concept later morphed into Exodus, because of course a coastal city with loads of civilians is literally what Exodus was, and hell, those suicide grunts in Exodus, they are quite literally, quote, seat of your pants terror. You were also meant to regroup and plan an attack, whatever that means in this level, and there was meant to be yet more infantry and weapon training that happened in a small town. Mission 3 was very different. So instead of Nightfall, it was meant to be a ground vehicle training level with wide open combat in a valley between mountains that ultimately resulted in a UNSC victory. Now, Reach never really had any combat like this, at least any open combat akin to, say, the Ark from Halo 3, for example. So I wonder if this idea was eventually kind of distilled down into Tip of the Spear, specifically its intro. Mission 4 was very different, and it was designed around a prototype style of gameplay that Bungie never nailed down, but that all these years later I'm still waiting for: water combat. The level was codenamed Covert SEALs Boat Attack, in which you'd undergo covert training, whatever that means, and then, in the dead of night, assault a Covenant ship offshore. Of course, a water-based ship, in a Navy SEALs-like fashion via your own boat, and then sink it. Needless to say, this sounds so awesome, especially the Navy SEALs style approach. I really do hope at some point water combat finally gets added to Halo, because I'd love to see boat combat and, honestly, even like swimming become core mechanics of the franchise. Level 5 was supposed to just be an intro to air combat, and it does sound pretty simple. You'd clear out an area from above, creating a safe route for supplies, presumably into the city from the second level. Level 6, however, sounds like Nightfall on steroids. Codenamed Sniper Training, it took place on a high ridge, just like Nightfall, except your objective was to take out Covenant leadership targets up in a ridge pass, which sounds really vibey. Any kind of assassination level is always up my alley, and you know, when it takes place in a high up ridge pass in the dead of night with a sniper, man, sign me up. Level 7 sounds very similar to the intro to Oni Alpha site in ODST. A bridge spanning a canyon is under heavy Covenant assault. This bridge formed a crucial part of a supply route to a resupply station, and so, at dusk, you'd hold the line armed with heavy weapons and explosives and defend the bridge. So yeah, sounds like a cross between the intro to Oni Alpha site and also the middle section of Tip of the Spear. Level 8, aptly codenamed Low Orbit Aerial Platform Attack, seems like a very early and frankly nowhere near as cool concept of Long Night of Solace. So the level plan was simply to defend a low orbit aerial platform from destruction whilst flying around a massive Covenant ship, dogfighting, and then eventually taking down said massive Covenant ship. Fighting around what sounds like a variant of the orbital defense platforms that we saw in Halo 2 does sound really cool, but come on, raiding a Corvette after dogfighting around it and sending it on a collision course into a supercarrier with a makeshift slip space bomb on board is just a billion times cooler than this. Level 9, Storm the City, kinda sounds like Exodus on steroids. So, as the name implies, it was once again set in a city, but this time with the urban combat dialed up to 11. Rockets would be blasting out of windows, with paper, glass, and office furniture raining down from the high-rises above. You'd play through the buildings, up to the upper levels for sniping down to more open areas, and then in the streets there'd be loads of destroyed and also partially functional vehicles for, and I quote Marcus, cover and fun. Which kinda makes me wonder if the legendary cut Halo 2 Uber chassis would have finally made its grand debut here. The objective of this level was rather simple, simply take back a portion of the city. Now I've been dying for more urban combat in Halo for years. I mean, we really haven't had any at all since Reach, and even then in Reach it was kinda brief. But this sounds like exactly the kind of gameplay that I'm craving. Maybe one day. The penultimate level seemingly had two different versions in this draft, both taking place at night and both revolving around the concept of assaulting a massive Covenant ship of some kind of variety, but not any kind of ship that we're used to. So the first version had you assaulting a huge Covenant ship at sea, a moving ship that we'd board and sink, and whilst we're on it, it'd slowly sink and pitch throughout the mission, which sounds pretty cool. I gotta say, the physics implications of that are really dope. And then the other version had us assaulting massive Covenant hover ships that hover low off the ground. We'd race around them on smaller craft before entering and destroying one from within, kinda like a Scarab on steroids. Marcus also highlighted the importance of having activity from other operations visible off in the distance, because they really wanted to drive home the idea that the war on Reach was far bigger than just what you were doing. This version does sound cool, but I'm just so drawn to the idea of water combat in Halo that the first version is just right up my alley. And then, the final level, as is becoming a little bit of a trend with this concept, sounds like Lone Wolf, but on steroids once again. Simply codenamed Last Great Battle, it took place in the afternoon and was exactly what the name implies. You'd fight off against wave after wave of different forces in a huge battle, and would even face off with Covenant Walkers too. Now, FYI, these Walkers aren't Scarabs, they're an entirely separate Covenant entity that we're going to come to later. In this encounter, you'd blast the Walkers to bits with artillery guns, while also being able to drive them yourself. Not gonna lie, this artillery gun standoff section does sound pretty similar to the Mach gun standoff at the end of Pillar of Autumn. However, the outcome of this last great battle isn't what you'd expect. The Allies would actually reign victorious, but even still, the UNSC top brass would make the call to abandon Reach to protect the Forerunner artifact, presumably the coordinates to Halo, so we could travel there and inherit our ancient birthright and reclaim that which our Forerunners left behind. This abandonment would of course result in the Covenant glassing the entire planet. And I gotta say, this is a very interesting alternate ending for Reach, seeing as in the regular canon, the Pillar of Autumn essentially had to flee the planet because the top brass knew that the entire thing was doomed. I do wonder how they would have been able to rationalize that in this alternate timeline. Suffice to say, Bungie's earliest concept for Reach's campaign was pretty different to what they locked down in the end. I do find it really interesting that there's no mention of the Pillar of Autumn at all in it, but that said, there's also no mention of the Forerunner artifact until right at the end when it said that it was evac from the planet, so I assume that was just because of how early and detail-light this draft was. Either way, intense urban combat and water-based combat are things that I would kill for in a future Halo game. So if all this Reach talk has given you a hankering to play some Halo, specifically on PC, then look no further than my flood-themed PCs made in partnership with Apex Gaming PCs to do so. From the pure form to the Gravemind and the ultra-powerful Primordial build, we've got a build of all levels of price point and power here for you to choose from. Just hit the link in the description and pick one of these bad boys up today. But the version of Reach's campaign that we ultimately got had some really cool stuff cut as well, and some of it was seemingly cut really late into development. Starting out on Winter Contingency, June's Falcon was actually meant to get shot down, which would have led to a very Black Hawk Down-esque segment for the level. Based on cut dialogue, it seems that right after you first engage the Covenant on the farm, the Banshees that show up were meant to shoot June's Overwatch Falcon down. The pilot would die in the crash, but of course June would radio in from the wreckage and tell you that he's still alive, and then you and Carter would split off from the rest of Noble Team to go and rescue him. As you get closer, June radios in that the Covenant are closing in on his position, and then when you arrive, you clear them out, save June, and then Falcon Charlie 2 comes in for evac. It's only a small segment, but I kind of feel like something that's so Black Hawk Down like this would have really fit the tone of Reach's story. Now, one of the most disappointing omissions from Reach was, of course, the Scarab fights. They were hands down the highlight of Halo 3, and for some reason, Reach had none. In fact, it had worse than none. It had one encounter that was literally just Bungie blueballing us. However, that wasn't always the case. Tip of the Spear was meant to include the first of Reach's originally plentiful Scarab encounters, which was meant to take place during the on-rails Falcon section through the canyon. The only info we have regarding this fight comes from some cut dialogue, which does seem pretty comprehensive.
Warning. Scans indicate a Scarab mobile assault platform.
You heard her, Noble. Engage with caution.
Bit late for that.
Only intel suggests the Scarab's armor is weakest to the rear.
Roger that. Hit it on the back side, Noble.
Unfortunately, the only Scarab that we ended up getting on Tip of the Spear was an LOD version off in the distance in the background, which, okay, granted, was part of that really cool vignette where the Grafton moves in for a bombing run and a flotilla of longswords bomb the lance off in the distance. Really, really cool. I gotta say, I fanboy whenever I see this, but as cool as this little section is, it doesn't come close to actually taking one down yourself. That said though, Reach's coolest Scarab encounter is yet to come. But before we get to it, there's just one little segment that was cut from Long Night of Solace that I've got to mention solely for nostalgia's sake. So instead of the Ardent Prayer's comms relay being taken out by the damage that we do to it in space, instead you originally had to disable it manually from within the ship, and the way that you did it was a very cool little Combat Evolved reference. So when you reached the ship's comm center, you had to step into the transmission beam to cause your shields to discharge, which overloaded the system, disrupted the relay, and took the comms offline, which is very clearly a reference to stepping into the phase pulse generator in 2 Betrayals in Halo 1. Yeah, it's a small detail, but I'm a sucker for small details, and when I saw this, I knew I had to just give it a mention. Now, Exodus may have been through several early iterations before becoming the level that we eventually got, but even when it became the level that we got, it still had some really awesome stuff cut. First of all, it seems as though in your crash back down to Reach, your visor would get cracked or smashed because there's loads of cut marine dialogue where they talk about fixing and repairing it.
I can repair that visor for you, Lieutenant.
Trouble with your visor, Spartan? I can take care of that for you.
Spartan, want me to do a quick fix on that visor?
All done, Lieutenant. Good hunting.
And I do wonder why this was cut. I think playing through the first third of Exodus with a cracked visor would have been really cool, but then again, the more I think about it, maybe they wanted to save that kind of feature for maximum impact during Lone Wolf. It probably wouldn't have felt as crazy seeing your visor crack at the end of the game had it already happened earlier on. I think seeing it crack for the first time on Lone Wolf is such a surreal experience, and had that already happened, it wouldn't have had the same impact. But hands down, the coolest bit of content that we lost on Exodus was an encounter that Bungie planned during the final section on the island when you're protecting the civilian evacuation. So remember the big ocean that island steeps into? Well, by the sounds of it, scarabs were meant to emerge out of that ocean onto the beach and storm the island, and over the comms, you'd hear Falcon pilots scrambling to circle them and gun them down. I assume that you would join up with them and destroy their cores to bring the beast down as well. And I gotta wonder, you remember that scarab encounter in Halo Wars 2, the really awesome fight where the banished scarab emerges from the ocean? Well, I wonder if that was inspired by this cut encounter. It seems like such a specific way to introduce a scarab, so I feel like it's gotta be. Either way though, inspired or not, I love how stylized that encounter was in Halo Wars 2, and I can only imagine how much more awesome it would have been in Reach as you watch this hulking beast of a machine emerge from the ocean in first person. Man, someone has gotta find a way to recreate this encounter. But arguably the biggest scarab-related encounter that was cut was on New Alexandria, but it's not the kind of encounter that you might be expecting. So in Halo 3, the level Cortana was originally going to involve a section where you actually got to pilot a scarab and fight through the infested city in it, even going as far as using it to destroy the Gravemind in a boss fight. But sadly, that was cut, and clearly Bungie were quite pissed about that because they tried to do a similar thing again in New Alexandria. Originally, New Alexandria would have been you piloting a scarab to cross the fully glassed terrain of the city. First, you'd hijack it, and then you could fully control it and move across parts of the city's edges. They even had a working prototype of a player-controlled scarab and even a mock-up of the city as well, and apparently the physics when you annihilated Covenant with the beam were awesome. But sadly, they had to cut it due to fears about how sustainable of an experience it was for any length of time, and also its extreme memory cost. New Alexandria then, of course, ended up becoming a Falcon-based Guardian Forest 2.0 after this version was cut. But mark my words, one day we are going to get a Halo game with a drivable scarab. Mark my words. And on the topic of scarabs, Reach had some really interesting and frankly just weird cut vehicles. Starting out with the Covenant Walker, which was only ever seen in 2 pieces of concept art, but as we covered earlier, had an entire section of the final level of the original campaign dedicated to it. Now, this thing really reminds me of a Covenant version of the geckos from MGS4. Isaac Hannaford, the concept artist who first visualized the Walker, intended for you to be able to knock it over by ramming it with a warthog, which I gotta say does sound pretty fun. But of course, it never went anywhere. And similarly, there was a huge Covenant siege engine that was cut from Reach as well, the Draugr, except this thing is actually now officially canon, which is pretty cool. Also originally designed by Isaac Hannaford, the Draugr was intended to be part of the 10th level of Reach's original campaign, where you take out huge Covenant hover platforms. Those hover platforms were the Draugrs. This thing looks really similar to Skynet's Hunter-Killer tank from, of course, Terminator, which Isaac Hannaford confirmed was of no coincidence. It also seems as though the Draugr was meant to make an appearance during the huge battle at the start of Tip of the Spear as well, and I gotta say, seeing them move towards you on the horizon is pretty ominous. They have quite a terrifying silhouette. Now, what if I told you that Reach was originally intended to have, and I promise I'm not joking, flying jackals? Well, there existed a vehicle of sorts called the Jackal Glider that apparently had a pretty advanced physics model compared to the other aerial vehicles in the game, even containing data for wings, a tail, rudders, drag, and a few other metrics as well. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I cannot imagine how intimidating it would have been to see a jackal with wings flying towards you. Ooh, makes me shudder down to my very skeleton. Now, arguably the most iconic Reach cut vehicle was, of course, the motorboat, the Warthog of the Seas. Reach's concept for water combat looks so good, and I really do hope that one day they actually get realised. But for now, all we can do is rewatch this very low quality footage where Bungie showed off their progress on it all the way back in 2010, and also stare at Isaac Hannaford's glorious concept art of said motorboat. One day. Now, just a very brief mention of this one of Isaac Hannaford's early concept arts for the Saber has now been canonised as a slightly different ship, called the Pegasus, and I just figured it was worth mentioning, solely because it's been canonised. I gotta say, I do love that edgy black and red paint job though. And finally, we have the most fleshed out cut vehicle that has actually now been partially restored by the dig site team, the APC. And funnily enough, this thing was supposed to have a very similar lockdown mechanic to the one that we saw for the Cobra in Halo Wars. It went through several renamings during development, starting out as the Wolverine, then later becoming the Kodiak, which, ironically, are both vehicles that now exist thanks to Halo Wars. The armament of this thing also seems to change with every bit of concept art, but I gotta say, every iteration does look pretty badass. Thankfully, it was half realised in Halo Wars 2 with the Mastodon APC, which does look pretty similar to it. If we ever do get a Battlefield-esque large-scale Halo game, I feel like a vehicle like this would be an awesome team-based inclusion. Okay, let's take a look at Reach's cut weapons now, and although, granted, there aren't that many, the few cut weapons that there are interesting to say the least. So, early on in Reach's development, Bungie actually planned on giving the rural civilians and militiamen of Reach their very own sandbox, and although these weapons sadly were never intended to be used by us, I still think they're really cool. There was a rifle, that same rifle with a scope, a shotgun, and then that very same shotgun with the barrel sawed down. Now, it goes without saying, but these weapons look really grounded. They look nothing like the UNSC weaponry that we're used to. They're not covered in little lights, little buttons, dials, thermal vision cameras, or anything like that. Just some very nice, down-to-earth, modern, rustic civilian-styled weaponry, which I do think fits the farmers and civilians of Reach. The rifle even looks like an ever so slightly more futuristic version of the VPO 101. These look like the exact kind of weapons that I would have expected to see in the rural areas of Reach. And also, the contrast of fighting alongside the militia, who were at this time using rudimentary firearms like these, whilst you and June were rocking the firearms industry's latest and greatest, would have been a really cool contrast, I think. Of course, in the end, these were never realised, and the militia just ended up using UNSC tech, which, granted, did spawn this really cool quip from June.
This stuff is stolen.
What, you gonna arrest me?
No, I'm gonna steal it back.
But I can't help but feel like they would have felt so much more like an authentic underground militia composed solely of civilians had they used the weapons that we're seeing here. Now, a very interesting cut weapon that I kind of briefly mentioned earlier that I had no idea about until I went down the rabbit hole for this video is the Forerunner Staff. So, for some reason, a wieldable Forerunner Staff was found in the files of Reach's DLC. Now, okay, complete schizo theory here, but I wonder if in some really early version of Reach's campaign that we've not seen yet, Bungie actually intended for us to venture deep into the Forerunner ship that Horsey was investigating, because outside of a few multiplayer maps that are entirely unrelated, that ship was the one single Forerunner thing in Reach, and so it seems obvious that this staff would have been found there. I mean, where the hell else would it have originated from? Man, can you imagine how awesome it would have been to find an almost Origins-esque altar with these staffs in at the core of that Forerunner ship? Oh, okay, I gotta stop dreaming up non-existent scenarios, I'm getting too excited. But I guess to caveat that schizo theory, the stuff was found in the DLC files of Reach, not the base game, so maybe it could have been a leftover from an early build that somehow snuck its way into the DLC files for some reason, or maybe it was something else entirely. Sadly, I feel like the truth of this thing might have vanished into darkness. Now, I'm just going to give this one a quick honorable mention because I know if I don't, I'm going to get 1,000 comments saying that I missed it out. The Reach LMG. So, despite only showing up in, I believe, one piece of concept art, this awesome-looking M249 SAW-inspired UNSC LMG has really become a fan-favourite weapon despite never existing. So much so that it's not only been recreated and added to Reach using God knows how many different mods, but it even inspired a weapon model in Halo Infinite. Personally, I think this thing looks way better than the SAW that we ended up getting, but sadly, Bungie never realised it. And the final notable cut weapon from Reach wasn't actually ever a weapon in Reach, nor was it cut, but just hear me out on this one. So I found an old comment from Isaac Hannaford once again about some wishes that he had for Reach's sandbox that never came to be. Weapons that were designed specifically for Spartans. When we started on Reach, we had the opportunity to redesign or invent new weapons for the Spartan arsenal. I wanted to follow up on the Spartan laser that Tom Doyle and I proposed with a few other Spartan-class weapon systems. One hope was that a Spartan assault rifle would be equivalent to a 50 cal machine gun and that their DMR would be closer to a 30mm light cannon. I was never satisfied with how little we did to depict the weight and enormous physical strength of the Spartans in-game. Okay, so I gotta say, the idea of a hand-portable 50 cal machine gun instead of the standard 308 AR that Halo's had for literally ever would be awesome, as much as it might of course invalidate the 50 BMG chain gun. But holy hell dude, a DMR in the 30mm ballpark would be insanity. So for reference, the standard DMR in Halo just fires 308, it's 7.62 by 51mm NATO, standard stuff. And you're wondering what 30mm is, right? Well, the A10 Warthog's Avenger autocannons fire 30mm rounds, so imagine having a round of that size in your back pocket. Not gonna lie, I really hope we do see that one day, as ridiculously powerful as it might seem. I do think a heavier class of Spartan-only weaponry like this that can only be used by Spartans, that's way more powerful than regular weaponry, but not quite as strong as the turrets, would be a really cool addition to Halo's sandbox. But then again, I'm definitely biased by the idea of a 30mm DMR, because goddamn, the thought of using that is so cool. As for cut enemies, besides a litany of weird wildlife ranging from hawks to porcupines to squirrels and even the Halo Reach slug, yep, that's a thing that exists, the only cut enemy that we really know anything about is, brace yourself, Buta Jockey Jackal. Yeah, there's a Minecraft movie reference in there somewhere. Now, I say cut, it was really just a concept that never made it past 2 pieces of concept art, but the idea of jackals riding a Guta like a bantha and even wielding a whip in doing so is so on brand for them as a species. I love that they even gave them Covenant-themed armor as well. This is a side of the Covenant that we've never really seen before, but I think one day I'd really like to. You know what, Halo Studios? Give us the Jackal Jockeys. So that about does it for all of the content that Bungie not only cut from Reach, but also their original version of the campaign that was rather different to what we ended up getting. Once again, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, because deep dives into cut content for me are just such an awesome bit of content to make, because it's like looking through a window into an alternate reality and hoping and praying that one day elements of that alternate reality come into our reality, like water combat for example. I cannot tell you how much I want Halo to finally get not only boots, but also, going one step further, swimming. I think that would be so sick. So leave your thoughts down below on what your favorite bit of cut content was in this video from Reach and also from any other Halo game as well. And with that said, I'm going to round this one out there. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual. Thank you all so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I'll catch you all in the next one.